There are great monster movies. And then there's King Kong. Released in 1933 at the very bottom of the Great Depression, King Kong wasn't just a film. It was a risk that bordered on insanity. A massive, terrifying spectacle made at a time when studios were collapsing, theaters were closing, and audiences were deciding whether a movie ticket was worth skipping dinner. Hollywood had no reason to believe a film like this would succeed, which is exactly why it mattered. The story of King Kong didn't begin with a giant ape or the Empire State Building. It began with obsession and with a belief that cinema could still overwhelm an audience when the real world offered nothing but anxiety. At the center of the film was Willis O'Brien, a pioneer of stop-motion animation who wasn't trying to make a monster movie at all. He was trying to prove that animation could feel, that a creature built from wire, rubber, and fur could express emotion frame by frame. O'Brien had animated prehistoric creatures before, but King Kong was different. This time, the creature wasn't just a technical demonstration. He was a character. Kong was never meant to be realistic. He was meant to be expressive. O'Brien animated him with hesitation, curiosity, anger, confusion, and sorrow. Kong pauses. He looks. He reacts. These moments were deliberate and radical for the time. To bring him to life, O'Brien and his team built a small, articulated puppet covered in real rabbit fur. Every movement required a physical adjustment. Every frame had to be photographed individually. The fur shifted slightly between frames, creating a visible shimmer on screen, something modern effects artists would immediately remove. But in 1933, that shimmer did something unexpected. It made Kong feel alive. Audiences didn't see a flaw, they saw breath, texture, presence. The illusion worked because it didn't aim for perfection, it aimed for emotion. Another key figure behind the film was Merian C. Cooper, co-director, producer, and the man who shaped King Kong's worldview. Cooper was an adventurer, a war pilot, and a storyteller fascinated by the clash between civilization and the untamed world. Cooper believed audiences were drawn to stories where modern humanity confronted something ancient and powerful, and lost control. That belief shaped everything about King Kong. The studio behind the film, RKO Pictures, was desperate. The Great Depression had devastated Hollywood, and spectacle had become a survival strategy. Studios needed something audiences could not ignore. King Kong was that gamble. The story followed an adventure structure audiences recognized. A filmmaker leads an expedition to an uncharted island in search of something extraordinary. But from the beginning, the tone was darker than most adventure films of the era. Skull Island isn't romantic. It isn't welcoming, it's hostile. The island reflects early 20th century fears of the unknown world, places labeled dangerous simply because they were unfamiliar. The expedition doesn't arrive seeking understanding or coexistence. They arrive seeking spectacle. And when they find Kong, their instinct isn't fear. It's ownership. Kong is captured, restrained, and removed from his world without hesitation. The film never pretends this is heroic. It presents it plainly. Exploitation disguised as discovery. Once Kong is brought to New York, the film transforms. The jungle nightmare becomes an urban tragedy. Kong is no longer a godlike presence. He is an attraction. Chained, displayed, mocked, crowds cheer as flashbulbs explode. Civilization congratulates itself for conquering nature. But the victory feels uneasy, hollow, and temporary. When Kong inevitably breaks free, the city doesn't feel heroic. It feels exposed. One of the most infamous sequences in the film was so disturbing it was removed shortly after the initial release. Known as the spider pit scene, it showed sailors who fall into a ravine being slowly killed by giant spiders, insects, and creatures emerging from the darkness. Audiences were horrified. The scene was considered too intense, too nightmarish, even for King Kong. It was cut, and the footage is now considered lost, surviving only in descriptions and later recreations. This wasn't unusual. King Kong was re-edited multiple times over the decades as censorship standards tightened. Violence was trimmed, suggestive imagery softened, screams shortened. The film was released before the strict enforcement of the production code, giving it an edge that later monster movies would struggle to match. Another revolutionary element often overlooked is the film's music. Composer Max Steiner created one of the first fully synchronized dramatic film scores in Hollywood history. Instead of relying on silence or background cues, Steiner scored Kong like a tragic opera, assigning musical themes to fear, wonder, romance, and death. The music didn't just accompany the action, it told the audience how to feel. Without Steiner's score, King Kong would not hit with the same emotional force. His work became the blueprint for every monster, adventure, and blockbuster score that followed. The Empire State Building, completed just 2 years earlier, was the tallest structure in the world. It symbolized modern ambition, steel, height, progress, and dominance over nature itself. Placing Kong atop it was no accident. When Kong climbs the building, the image becomes more than spectacle. It becomes a confrontation between nature and industry, instinct and machinery. Something alive and a world determined to control it. The airplanes that attack Kong represent modern technology at its most impersonal. They kill from a distance. There is no negotiation, no understanding. Kong doesn't die in a heroic battle, he is executed. What's often overlooked is how shocking this ending was for 1933 audiences. Hollywood films of the era almost always reassured viewers. Heroes triumphed, order was restored. But King Kong refuses to offer that comfort. There is no celebration after Kong's fall, no victory parade, just silence. The camera lingers, the crowd gathers. People stare down at the body. Kong's death feels final and wrong. That unease was intentional. Once Kong is removed from Skull Island, he never belongs anywhere again. He doesn't understand the city, he doesn't understand the people, and they make no effort to understand him. In that sense, King Kong becomes less a monster movie and more a cautionary tale about what happens when curiosity is driven by ego instead of responsibility. This theme resonated deeply during the Depression. Audiences were watching institutions fail, banks collapsed, jobs disappeared. The promise of progress felt hollow. King Kong mirrored that anxiety by showing modern confidence unraveling the moment it encountered something it couldn't control. Behind the scenes, the production demanded extraordinary performances. Fay Wray's portrayal of Anne Darrow became legendary, largely through fear alone. She screamed so often during filming that her voice reportedly became strained, later joking that screaming was her greatest contribution to cinema. What made her performance work was imagination. She was often reacting to empty space, no monster, no ape, just belief. The dinosaur sequences shocked audiences in ways no film ever had. These creatures weren't playful. They fought, they struggled, they died. The violence felt physical and real. Every one of those moments was animated by hand. No computers, no shortcuts, only patience. The success of King Kong was immediate and overwhelming. Lines wrapped around theaters. Word of mouth spread fast. RKO rushed a sequel into production the same year. That sequel, Son of Kong, arrived only months later. Lighter in tone, shorter, and less ambitious. It performed well, but proved something important. Kong himself was irreplaceable. Despite its fantasy elements, King Kong was never a children's movie. The imagery was intense, the violence unsettling. Some theaters even issued warnings. But audiences responded powerfully. They were frightened, they were moved, they were silent. The film saved RKO financially. It reshaped Hollywood's understanding of spectacle, and it changed what a monster could be. Before Kong, monsters were obstacles. After Kong, they were tragedies. That's why King Kong keeps being remade. Not because of the size of the creature, but because of the emotion. Each generation returns to Kong to ask the same question in a different way. What happens when humanity meets something it cannot control? Kong never speaks. He never explains himself. The audience is left to project meaning onto him, and in doing so, confront their own interpretation of the story. Is he a monster? A victim? A mirror? Nearly a century later, Kong still stands, not because he was the biggest monster ever put on screen, but because he was the most human. And that's the real legacy of King Kong, a monster movie that understood something Hollywood still struggles with today. Sometimes the most terrifying thing isn't the creature climbing the building, it's the crowd waiting below.